This study was actually developed by one of my graduate students, Sarah Simmons, who thought it would be an interesting way for students to engage in doing research as part of an introductory marine science lab. And we developed this so that they could learn about the issue of mislabeling of seafood products, and we were not the first people to discover this. People have known about this seafood mislabeling problems for years. And so it was just a way to let students experience it in a very personal way as opposed to just teaching about it. They could actually discover it for themselves. And it was actually through the process of doing this multiple years and realizing that the rates of mislabeling weren't changing despite legislation that was designed to prevent seafood fraud, that the study suddenly became much more interesting because we were really one of the first to do this kind of sampling every year over many, many years and show that these patterns are quite consistent. The way that the study is conducted is quite simple. Students would go to a sushi restaurant, they would order sushi, they would confirm with the sushi chef or the waiter what they had been served, they would write that down, and then take a small piece of the fish for genetic sampling. They would do the genetic testing back in the lab and compare the results of the genetics to what they had been told by the sushi chef or the waiter. The fraud varied. So in certain restaurants, the fraud would be described more as, I would say, cultural semantics. So in certain restaurants, when you ordered red snapper, you would be served what is commonly known as red sea bream. Now, if you ordered if you ordered what we consider red snapper here in a restaurant in Tokyo, you would be served red sea bream. I believe the Japanese name is Maddai. So if you order Maddai in Japan, you get red sea bream. U.S. consumers don't know what red sea bream is. And so when you order Maddai in the U.S. and they translate the menu into English, you get red snapper. The U.S. The Food and Drug Administration only allows one species of fish to be sold legally under the market name red snapper. So even though you were being served exactly what you would be served in a restaurant in Tokyo when you order Maddai, legally it is seafood fraud. There are other kinds of seafood fraud where they were substituting things like tilapia for red snapper. That's not a cultural misunderstanding. That's not semantics. That is deliberately switching a low-value fish for a high-value fish. So in the examples of restaurants that had low rates of seafood fraud, the kind of fraud that you would see there is the cultural misunderstanding type. In other restaurants, particularly more budget-oriented sushi restaurants, you would get the more deliberate kind of seafood fraud, where you're substituting a low-value fish for a high-value fish. You know, I love sushi. I would hate to tell anyone that they should avoid eating fish, avoid eating sushi. I think what's important, I think what consumers could do is not necessarily avoid sushi restaurants at this point. There may be things that they want to think about when they order on the menu. Things like halibut, because if they are serving olive flounder instead of halibut, there is a parasite that can be in that halibut that causes food poisoning. And occasionally in Japan, there are outbreaks of food poisoning that come from eating olive flounder. So if you're ordering, I might not order halibut, because if you do get olive flounder, you could be exposed to this parasite and get food poisoning. I think what would be good for consumers to do is to talk with sushi chefs and talk with their wait staff at these restaurants and say, you know what, I've read this study that says there are really high rates of substitution. There's really high rates of fraud in what is being served in sushi restaurants. What procedures do you have in place to make sure that you are buying the fish that you think you're buying? What procedures do you have in place to ensure that you are serving me what you're saying you're serving me? And really start to engage them in a conversation that makes them realize that consumers want this information. They want those assurances. They want to know that they're getting what they paid for.